Hello, this is Dr. Dan. In this presentation, we are going to discuss the proposal defense, including preparation and the actual presentation itself. Important topics that will be addressed include the definition and general format of a proposal defense, basically what it is, how to prepare for it, including outlining the defense, presentation, reviewing over literature and the methodology and the statistical analyses that will need to be done and included in the presentation. And then finally, the presentation itself, including the PowerPoint, how to design it, some key points that need to be in there, and pros and cons of inserting certain information, practicing for it, and then finally the presentation. So what is a proposal defense? A proposal defense can vary to some degree based on the university, perhaps the field of study, the department, the program, the various mentors or dissertation chairs, and even the students themselves that are presenting. The example that will be used here will be Keiser University, specifically the graduate school, the psychology department, and then not using any names, but just basically I'll give some examples of how mentors may vary as well as students may vary in how the proposal defense is constructed and presented. The proposal defense itself, in general, is an oral presentation that is conducted by the student to a dissertation committee. The presentation will go over what the study's about, perhaps why it's being conducted, who on the target population, and so forth, where it's being done, not necessarily just virtually, but is social media being used? Is it a quasi-experimental study at a organization or something of that nature? So that is what a proposal defense is. Now let's go ahead and transition into some of the important details that students need to know. The proposal defense is based on the first 3 chapters of a 5-chapter model. The 3 chapters include introduction, literature review, and methodology section. And the proposal defense will follow along with those first 3 chapters. The first 2 chapters, which you have in front of you here, chapters 1 and 2, is based on the literature. The difference between the two is chapter 1 is more of an introduction to the topic and the study itself. The literature that's reflected in chapter 1 may be more historical, theoretical, leading up to the contemporary literature and the topics. It may also include the problem itself. Perhaps the variables need to be explored more because they haven't addressed certain target population or something, and then even somewhat of what you might call a prediction. So in other words, the hypotheses based on the literature. What is the student hypothesizing? Sometimes you'll find that those research questions and hypotheses are within the narrative or more structured, laid out in chapter 1. Sometimes that's done in chapter 3 or even sometimes both. Chapter 2 is more in-depth now, literature review. Less perhaps, although sometimes some of that theory and history is included in chapter 2 as well. Most definitely, chapter 2 needs to go through the contemporary research that has been done on the variables that the researcher, the student, is going to explore. The organization of the proposal defense within chapter 2 can somewhat vary. For example, if a student has, let's say, 2 main variables that are being explored, they may want to go through each one individually. And as they address one variable, perhaps discuss the various previous studies that have been done on that, the populations, the samples, the methodologies, the measures, and so on, and then move on to the next one. However, it may also be that the student looks at each individual variable, maybe just the research itself, but then when they go over the measures, maybe it's measures of both all at once. And maybe if they look at the methodologies that have been used, they address both and so on. So there's some subtle differences between the way the information can be constructed. It'll be based very typically on the actual manuscript But there's some subtle differences in how that information is presented. But the literature that is presented must be scholarly, must be original research. Oftentimes, meta-analyses are included to look for various themes that are within the literature. And once a student has done this, once they've gone through chapters 1 and 2, they will have also demonstrated their knowledge of the subject matter. It is, I think, very important for students to understand that this information should not be read. It should be discussed more extemporaneously to demonstrate the student actually understands what they're talking about. I'm going to go over some of this more details as I go through the PowerPoint later. Chapter 3, the methodology section, is a bit different from chapters 1 and 2 because chapters 1 and 2 goes over the literature, whereas chapter 3 is now the student's study. This is I like using the example, which again I'm going to show you. I'll show you here shortly. I like using the example of a recipe for making something. You want to have these instructions down, so whatever it is you're making will turn out like you want it to turn out. Well, that's what chapter 3. That's how that should be structured, both the manuscript as well as the defense. The proposal defense is an opportunity, however, for the committee as well as anyone else that may be attending, other faculty or students, guests, so on. It's an opportunity for them also to look to see what you plan to do and perhaps discover some challenges that maybe, let's say, a student has not considered. So within the chapter 3, the methodology part of the presentation, first and foremost, the student will reveal the research questions and hypotheses, and then go over each step of the process and any details that need to be addressed, beginning with, let's say, the Institutional Review Board or the IRB proposal process, who the target population is. Of course, that IRB process, by the way, that could be, again, like some of these things, and maybe in a different spot of this chapter 3 methodology section. I just put that first because that's done before any data is collected, so it made kind of sense to me. But then, of course, there's who's the target population, how is a student going to draw a sample from that, what instruments will be used, how will the data actually be collected, some of those details. In other words, we'll be at a meeting, social media, so on. Once the data has been collected, screening and cleaning that data. Once that is done and everything's ready to go, the statistical analyses that are performed, including descriptive and inferential statistics, the various assumptions that need to be met, of course, to run those analyses. And then also assumptions can also be a bit different, meaning there's assumptions of analyses, but also assumptions that are just inherent with the type of research that's being conducted. So for example, if it's a self-report survey, then the assumption is that people are going to answer honestly. So there's that content, limitations of a study, and then of course ethical considerations. That is a lot of information to address, and very commonly that's going to take about an hour, including questions and answers to complete, to get through that stuff. Now, preparing for a proposal defense, of course, you already have been shown everything that's included, so that's part of that preparation, is taking all that information, creating an outline for yourself, and then once you, being the student, the researcher, has this outline, now you can begin to add the details. And that outline, of course, perhaps even most importantly, for the methodology section, that's where we're going to discuss this concept of creating a recipe. That's why I have that on here. So the literature, it is not going to be, of course, every single article that was, or shouldn't be anyways. If it's every article, then either it's going to be an extremely long presentation or the student hasn't explored enough research because they may have 100, 150 articles. But key studies, seminal studies in the area that's being focused on, key examples of the literature, those are what are used within the presentation itself. And it's very common for almost every single slide within chapters 1 and 2 to have examples of literature. And then again, in chapter 3, now you have that methodology statistics section. So when you're preparing for that, really think to yourself, okay, how will I be actually conducting this study? Well, that's how the presentation should look. Every little step, there should not be anything excluded out of that, because what you want to be able to do to some degree is use chapter 3 as a recipe to go back, and when you're actually begins conducting your study, you can follow along almost like a checklist and check off each step. The proposal defense presentation, that includes, of course, the PowerPoint, practicing, and then the presentation itself. The PowerPoint should be kept simple. There is plenty of literature to support, by the way, the advice I'm going to give you. After teaching public speaking for several years, I cannot stress more the importance of some of this advice that I'm going to give you. Keeping a PowerPoint simple is, if you look at any presentation that has been conducted at a higher level, let's say a TED Talk or major CEOs of corporations that will be speaking and so on, you will rarely, if ever, find complex PowerPoints. They're going to be simple. They're going to be maybe even many times just like one very simple image, like an apple or something like that that's up there, and it helps the audience understand what you're talking about. So on the PowerPoint, what I recommend to keep it simple is have a title on each slide. Keep that simple, 1, 2, 3 words. Then the audience will very quickly know what you are planning to address on that slide. Again, minimal information, not sentences, but if you have bullet points like you see here, I've given you an example as I've gone through this presentation. So just keep the information simple there. Use an image to help the audience understand what you're talking about, what you're going to be addressing. Perhaps add a source or two when needed. And then finally, what you plan to do. So this example that you have here in front of you, this actual slide, you will see where I've done this. So I have the title of the slide, Proposal Defense Presentation. The bullet points are very simple. I have an image here of an actual PowerPoint program, and which gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Practicing for the defense, do encourage anyone that's going to be doing a presentation to practice, of course, by themselves, but then also take that a step further, perhaps, and practice in front of friends. And then finally, every single student, if you're not asked to do this, I do highly recommend that you yourself ask the committee to have an opportunity to practice in front of the committee. That is critical. I personally have done that with my students for, I believe, every single presentation that has been done over the last 10 years. And so when you practice in front of the committee, you can oftentimes work out some important things that otherwise may have been missed. And by doing so, then you have time to correct them before the actual proposal defense. What is too much information? Again, that's a little bit subjective. However, I would argue that if there's the amount of information on a slide, if it becomes distracting, where the audience is no longer listening to you because they're trying to figure out what's on an image, or they're reading the slide and so on, if it's distracting, that's too much. So keep it simple. Now, finally, the presentation. Many times individuals never think about what to do physically before a presentation. In other words, pre-hydrating. I will regularly drink water before I present, so that way my mouth doesn't become dry. That way I can speak clearly and not have to worry about this physical challenge that I might be having if I was dehydrated, for instance. That's something many times people do not think about, but it's very important. Dress professionally. Of course, that can vary based on each individual. However, just understand who your audience is, why you're there, and for that matter, possibly even the background. If you're in a live setting, that would definitely matter. Virtually as well. What's behind you? Who is in the room? Are there distractions and some of these things? So that should be considered. Making sure the room is quiet, comfortable, and you have an opportunity to focus on your presentation without outside distractions. Do not read the presentation. If you read it, you do not demonstrate an understanding of the subject matter. So it needs to be conducted more or less extemporaneously. Do not use notes I think that's what my little bullet point was up there. I think I just didn't finish my thought up there, but do not use notes on the slides. The slides are your notes. In other words, what you're looking at right here, this proposal defense presentation slide that I have ahead of me, I have limited words for each bullet, and those words tell me what I need to discuss, and I discuss each one of them. I have an image on here, so I can use that within my presentation, and I can it also can help remind me of what I want to talk about, but there are no other notes. You'll notice I'm not, hopefully you notice I'm not reading this. I am presenting this extemporaneously, naturally. I'm being myself, and that's what we want to see. I hope you learned a lot from this presentation, and hopefully this is going to help you better prepare and present your proposal defense.